Here's something that might sound strange at first, but stay with me. A lot of narcissistic men are not, in the fullest sense of the word, psychologically heterosexual, even though physically and sexually they absolutely are. They date women, they flirt with them, they marry them and build families with them. But underneath all of that, their real loyalty, their deepest need for approval, their whole emotional compass points toward other men. I'm not talking about romance or sexual attraction here. I'm talking about something much darker and much harder to name, a fixation on male dominance, a desperate, almost addictive craving for validation from other men. And underneath it all, a quiet, corrosive belief that women are somehow less than, somehow fundamentally flawed. This goes way beyond simple attraction to male company. What we're really looking at is a form of emotional codependency on male approval, and calling it anything softer than misogyny would be dishonest. Because that's exactly what it is, in its purest, rawest form. These men treat women like prizes to be won and displayed, while treating other men like gods to be worshipped. A man like this will be intimate with his wife at night and then spend the next morning consumed with anxiety, wondering whether his best friend's father approves of the way he's living his life, or whether his older brother thinks he's making the right choices. His whole sense of what it means to be a man doesn't come from within him. It's handed down and constantly reapproved by a circle of male figures whose judgment somehow outweighs the emotional well-being of his own wife. That's the core of it. He is emotionally hooked on dominance and hierarchy among men more than he is committed to the woman standing right beside him. Think about how strange that actually is when you slow down and look at it. This is a grown man, a husband, sometimes even a father himself, and yet he behaves like a teenager desperate for a nod of approval from the older boys in the group. He'll lie awake replaying a conversation with his brother-in-law, wondering if he came across as strong enough, assertive enough, man enough. Meanwhile, his wife could be sitting right next to him, emotionally starving for 5 minutes of real attention, and he won't even notice she exists in that moment. That's how deep this conditioning runs. It doesn't shut off just because he loves someone or thinks he does. The male hierarchy runs quietly in the background of his mind at all times, like some invisible operating system he never chose to install, but can't seem to uninstall either. I want to introduce myself before I go further into this. My name is Danish, and I focus on helping people recover from narcissistic abuse. This isn't just something I read about in a textbook somewhere. I've spent years quietly watching this exact pattern play out, a pattern most people walk right past without ever noticing it's there. What I'm going to lay out for you today isn't some abstract theory I dreamed up. It's something I lived through personally. It happened inside my own family, right in front of me. And if you've ever survived narcissistic abuse yourself, there's a good chance you've sensed this exact dynamic before, even if you never had the words to describe it. So today we're going to give it a name, and we're going to call it out for what it really is. Over the years I've worked with survivors, I've noticed something interesting. Almost every woman I talk to who has lived through this describes the exact same feeling, even though they've never met each other. Even though they come from completely different backgrounds, different cultures, different corners of the world, they all describe this sense of being present, but invisible, of being physically inside the marriage, while somehow being excluded from the actual decision-making core of it. That consistency across so many different stories is what convinced me this wasn't just a strange coincidence in my own family. It's a pattern, it's a system, and systems can be understood, named, and eventually dismantled, but only once you can actually see them clearly for what they are. Let me be clear about something important right away. This has absolutely nothing to do with sexual orientation. A gay man might feel no sexual pull toward women whatsoever, and that says nothing about how he values them as people. In fact, plenty of gay men build some of their closest, most meaningful friendships with women, precisely because they genuinely respect their intelligence, their humanity, their inner strength. Sexual attraction and genuine respect are two entirely separate things, and it's important we don't confuse them here. You can desire someone and disrespect them at the same time. You can also feel zero desire for someone and hold them in the deepest respect imaginable. This whole conversation isn't about who men want to sleep with. It's about who men consider worthy of an equal seat at the table of their own lives. A narcissistic man operates completely differently. He looks at women and sees something beneath him. He can be straight, he can be married, he can have kids. But somewhere in his mind, women exist as emotional support staff, as caretakers, as background scenery in the movie where he's the only main character. He doesn't actually respect their opinions, their voice, or their right to make their own choices. What he wants from a woman is for her to orbit quietly around his ego, never questioning him, never pushing him to grow, never challenging the image he's built of himself. And here's where things get genuinely twisted from a psychological standpoint. A man caught in this pattern isn't really functioning as his own person. He's more like a puppet controlled by the expectations of other men. His sense of self isn't rooted in his values, his honesty, or what he actually believes is right. It's rooted entirely in how other men see him. He lives in constant fear of being perceived as weak, soft, overly emotional, or somehow controlled by a woman. In his mind, that would be the deepest possible humiliation he could suffer. That fear explains why he'd sooner betray his own wife than risk disappointing his brother. It explains why he'll gamble with his family's stability just to keep his standing inside the unspoken hierarchy of men around him. This isn't just some detached idea I picked up from a psychology journal. It was the actual texture of my childhood. My father was basically a psychological echo of his own father, a shadow cast by someone else's shadow. Every single decision made in our household, whether it was something huge or something tiny, passed through an invisible governing body made up of my grandfather and my father's brothers. My mother did the cooking, she did the cleaning, she worked outside the home too, and yet she never really had a vote in anything that mattered. Even though she herself carried some covert narcissistic traits, she still had no real say in where we lived, which schools we attended, whether we borrowed money or whether we bought land. Her voice was treated as optional, something you could take or leave. My grandfather's voice, though, never optional. My uncle's opinions, never optional. Their approval was treated like something sacred, untouchable. There were entire stretches of time where we, as a family living under one roof, had no idea what was actually happening in our own home. My father kept secrets from us. He'd shut us out of things that directly affected our lives, but his brothers knew. His father knew everything, every detail, every plan. It was like a closed circle of men who were only emotionally loyal to one another, feeding off each other's egos, treating their own wives and daughters like minor characters in a story that was really about them. The women handled the actual labor of running the household. The men handled the decision-making. That was the silent, unwritten rule nobody ever said out loud, but everybody understood. These men weren't really living their own lives at all. They were performing an idea of masculinity, specifically for each other's benefit, and that performance had nothing authentic about it. It was staged. It was a kind of theatrical display of dominance that depended entirely on how the other men in the room were behaving. None of it had anything to do with honesty, fairness, kindness, or actually building something stable. It was always about ego, control, and reputation. I remember watching my mother find out about major financial decisions the same way a neighbor might, through secondhand conversation, through something overheard, through a comment someone else's wife let slip. She would piece together the truth of her own life in fragments long after the men had already decided everything. And what struck me even more, looking back now as an adult who studies these patterns for a living, is that nobody in that family ever seemed to question it. It wasn't treated as unusual or wrong. It was simply how things were done, generation after generation, quietly normalized until it became invisible, until it became the water everyone was swimming in without ever noticing they were wet. That's what makes these patterns so hard to break. Nobody announces the rule. Nobody writes it down. You just absorb it by watching, the same way I absorbed it, the same way my father absorbed it from his own father before him. Here's the irony that makes this whole thing almost tragic. These men genuinely believe they're alpha males, top of the food chain. But the truth is closer to the opposite. They're emotionally hollowed out. They can't make a single decision without first running it through some invisible filter of what the men around them will think. They're more afraid of being rejected by other men than they are of causing real pain to their own wives. That makes them dependent, codependent even, on a patriarchal system in a way that's honestly both sad and genuinely harmful. Picture what real strength would actually look like here, just for a moment as a contrast. Real strength would be a man standing beside his wife even when his brother disapproves. Real strength would be telling his father, respectfully but firmly, that his marriage is his own to navigate. Real strength would be sitting with his wife's pain instead of running from it toward the comfort of male validation. None of that requires giving up masculinity. If anything, it requires more of it, a version rooted in actual courage rather than performance. But that kind of strength terrifies these men precisely because it can't be measured by anyone else's approval. It has to come from inside, and that's exactly the muscle they've never had to build because the men around them have spent a lifetime building the scaffolding for them instead. Let me walk you through some patterns that show up when this dynamic is in play. Things you might recognize if you've lived close to it. First, he minimizes his wife's opinions whenever other men are around. If she makes a genuinely valid point, he'll cut her off, crack a joke to deflect, or steer the conversation somewhere else entirely. It's not because she's wrong. It's because he can't afford to look like he takes guidance from a woman in front of his male friends. Second, his personality shifts depending on who's in the room. Around his male circle, he gets louder, more aggressive, ruder, and more dismissive toward his wife, his kids, or his girlfriend. He puts on this exaggerated, hyper-masculine version of himself, one that has zero tolerance for emotion, sensitivity, or any kind of compromise. Third, the big decisions in his life get worked out between him and the men in his family, not with his wife. She might be living under the same roof, raising the same kids, and still be the very last person to find out about something major. His father hears it first. His brother hears it first. His friends hear it before she does. Fourth, he protects loyalty to men over loyalty to his own wife. If she gets mistreated by one of his male relatives, guess who he defends? Not her. He'll bend logic, dodge responsibility, or straight up gaslight her into thinking she's overreacting, just to avoid confronting another man. Fifth, he happily takes advantage of a woman's labor while refusing to share any actual power with her. She can work for him, earn money for him, take care of him emotionally and physically, and still get denied any real authority over basic household decisions. Whatever she contributes gets treated like it was owed to him anyway, not like something valuable she chose to give. Sixth, he worships male dominance and quietly views anything feminine as weakness. He'll mock men who show emotion or cry. He'll shame women who take charge or lead. To him, softness and submission are the same thing, and both disgust him. So instead of ever showing real emotion, he hides behind sarcasm, cold silence, or outright anger. Seventh, he talks about his wife with his male friends, not because he genuinely wants their advice, but because it boosts his own status. It's a performance of control, a way of proving he's the one running the show. Meanwhile, his wife has no idea her entire life is being picked apart like gossip over drinks. Eighth, and this one really says a lot, he cannot handle being criticized by a woman, but he'll happily accept the exact same criticism from a man. If his wife challenges him on something, he either explodes or completely shuts down. But if a man points out the same flaw, he'll actually listen, maybe even reflect on it, maybe even thank him for it. That's not some quirk of personality. That's hierarchy, plain and simple. Ninth, he doesn't view his wife as an equal partner at all. He sees her more like a service provider. Her emotional needs feel like a burden to him. Her boundaries feel disrespectful to him. Her intelligence feels threatening to him. Deep down, he's not looking for someone equal to build a life with. He's looking for someone who will serve him emotionally without asking for anything back. 10th, he's more afraid of being shamed by other men than he is of failing emotionally as a husband or partner. If the men around him mock him for letting his wife have any real say, he would rather blow up the entire marriage than risk being seen as weak by a group of men who, frankly, are cowards themselves. If you're recognizing more than one or two of these patterns as you go through them, take a moment and really sit with that. These signs don't usually show up in isolation. They tend to travel together, reinforcing each other, forming this larger architecture of control that can take years to even see clearly, let alone name out loud. And the reason it takes so long to see is simple. On the surface, everything can look completely normal. He goes to work, he provides financially, he shows up to family functions, he might even say the right things when people are watching. It's only in the quiet, unwitnessed moments, the ones that never make it onto social media or into small talk with the neighbors, that the real hierarchy reveals itself. That's the moment his voice changes. That's the moment her opinion suddenly stops mattering. That's the moment the mask slips just enough for you to catch a glimpse of what's actually running the show underneath. So, is that psychological heterosexuality? Not even close. What you're actually looking at is a warped kind of brotherhood, one that survives by suppressing women and staying obedient to other men. Inside that kind of dynamic, a narcissistic man can never really be intimate with a woman in any meaningful sense because real intimacy isn't just physical. It demands vulnerability, and vulnerability is the one thing that gets punished inside his little male fraternity. So he stays emotionally closed off, sexually engaged, but psychologically shackled to the approval of other men. Let's not soften this. What we're describing is misogyny, plain and simple. This isn't just a guy who enjoys hanging out with the boys. This is a worldview where women get reduced to tools, to caretakers, to distractions from what really matters to him. It's a world where a man can marry a woman, have children with her, use her in every practical sense, and still genuinely believe she doesn't deserve to be informed about, let alone included in, decisions about her own life. It's a world where a woman can share a bed with her husband every single night and still be treated like a stranger in her own home. That was my father's world. In a lot of ways, it still is. And he was far from the only one living inside it. Every man in his family treated the women in their lives the exact same way. I grew up watching men treat their own wives as afterthoughts while bending over backward to please the opinions of the older men in the family. It wasn't just quiet neglect either. Behind closed doors, they belittled these women, mocked them, made them feel invisible. The woman was the one actually running the household day to day, but the moment you stepped outside those walls, her voice simply didn't count for anything. And that kind of double life, that split between what's true at home and what's performed outside it, damages children, wrecks marriages, and gets passed down generation after generation like some kind of inheritance nobody asked for. I want to name something else here too because it matters. This pattern doesn't just hurt the wife. It hurts the children who grow up watching it. Sons learn without ever being explicitly taught that this is what manhood looks like, that love and control are supposed to blur together, that a father's silence toward his mother's pain is just how things are. Daughters learn, just as quietly, that their voice is decorative, that their opinions are tolerated rather than valued, that the men in their life will always answer to other men before they answer to them. I carried pieces of that conditioning myself for years before I ever had language for it. It took real distance, real study, and honestly, a lot of unlearning to even begin separating what I was taught was normal from what was actually healthy. That process isn't quick and it isn't comfortable, but it is absolutely possible, and I promise you it's worth doing. This is exactly why I keep saying that narcissistic men aren't psychologically straight in the fullest sense. Because being straight isn't only about who you're physically attracted to. It's about your internal alignment with the opposite sex. It's about whether you actually respect them. It's about your genuine capacity to form an emotional bond and your willingness to see them as your equal rather than your subordinate. A man who's secretly afraid of women's minds while worshiping control among men isn't living out a healthy heterosexuality. He's more accurately described as a psychological servant to patriarchy. He isn't building an actual life with a woman. He's using her and quietly outsourcing his entire decision-making process to the men around him. So, if you're a woman reading this and you recognize yourself in any part of it, if you feel like a ghost inside your own marriage, if you're the one doing all the emotional and physical labor while your husband still runs straight to his father, his brother, or his friend for every important decision, if he brushes off what you say but takes advice from an uncle who barely shows up sober, if you feel married on paper but somehow still standing outside the actual circle of trust, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not imagining things. You are not crazy. You are seeing something real, something true, and that truth is exactly what terrifies these men the most. I know how isolating it feels when you can sense something is deeply wrong, but you can't quite point to a single moment that proves it. There's no one incident you can hold up and say, look, this is the proof. It's the accumulation, the 1,000 tiny moments where your voice got talked over, where your instincts got dismissed, where you learned to shrink your own opinions before anyone else even had the chance to. That slow erosion is real damage, even when it doesn't leave a visible mark. And naming it, actually calling it what it is, isn't about blame for the sake of blame. It's about finally understanding the shape of what you've been living inside so you can start making decisions from a place of clarity instead of confusion. And to any man listening to this who feels a little defensive right now, let me ask you something directly. If your wife and one of your male friends gave you completely opposite advice on something important, whose voice would actually carry more weight in your decision? If your father disapproved of a choice you made, but your wife stood behind you fully, would you keep moving forward, or would you quietly back down? If your partner told you she was in pain, would you actually validate what she's feeling? Or would you run off to ask your brother whether you're being too soft for caring? Sit with those questions honestly, even if the honest answer makes you uncomfortable. Discomfort is actually a good sign here. It usually means you're brushing up against something true instead of something you've rehearsed for the sake of looking good. Nobody becomes healthier by defending an image of themselves. Growth only starts the moment you're willing to look at the gap between who you think you are and how you actually behave when nobody outside the marriage is watching. That gap is where all the real work lives, and it's uncomfortable precisely because it's honest. Your honest answers to those questions reveal a lot more than your sexual orientation ever could. They reveal your actual psychology. Because being psychologically straight, in the way I'm describing it, means genuinely respecting women as complete human beings, not just desiring them physically. It means recognizing them as whole people rather than roles you've assigned them. It means building a life where their voice matters just as much as your father's opinion ever did. And until men are willing to actually unlearn this deep emotional dependence on male approval and dominance, they'll keep calling themselves straight, calling themselves alpha, while quietly living as closeted misogynists underneath it all. Change here isn't impossible, though. I've watched men break out of this pattern, but it never happens by accident. It happens when a man gets honest enough to admit that his identity has been built entirely out of borrowed opinions and brave enough to start building something of his own instead. That process usually starts small. It starts with actually listening when his wife speaks, not just waiting for his turn to respond. It starts with making a decision without first checking how it will land with his father or his brother. It starts with tolerating the discomfort of disappointing another man in order to actually show up for the woman standing in front of him. None of that is easy, and I won't pretend otherwise. Unlearning an entire inherited worldview never is. But it is possible. And the men who manage it describe it as the first time they've ever actually felt like themselves, rather than a character performing for an audience of other men who were never really watching that closely to begin with. If any part of this resonated with you today, whether you're the woman living inside this pattern or the man beginning to recognize himself in it, know that awareness is always the first real step. You can't change what you refuse to see, and you can't heal from something you haven't yet let yourself name. That's really the whole purpose of this channel, to help put language to experiences that so often get dismissed, minimized, or explained away before anyone even gets the chance to understand them fully. That brings us to the end of today's video. I really hope this gave you something to think about. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know if you've recognized any of these patterns in your own life or in someone close to you. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care of yourself and let the healing begin.